Hi, welcome to our last lesson in the series, How We Got the Old Testament, lesson number 5. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most, if not the most significant discoveries or finds from a significance of the Bible, God's Word. Last time we were talking about why this is so significant, and this was really the crux of this series of lessons, is that as we look through, we're looking for this concrete evidence to find manuscripts, copies in the original language, that we could make our own translation of the Old Testament. And I couch that in terms of us living in the 1940s, wanting to do that. And of course, the idea was that prior to the 1940s, there really wasn't good manuscript evidence. There was some fragments of manuscripts. There was the synagogue scrolls dating around 250 BC, but they didn't survive. And so, like, if you want to talk about the earliest really good source, it's not a manuscript, it's a translation. It's what's called a version, making a translation from the original Hebrew into a different language, in this case, the Greek. And for a long time, that was really the significant copy that we would have of the Old Testament. And then we get into the New Testament times, AD 30, the start of the church. We know that the New Testament books start to be written and copied and passed on from church to church, circulated. But what about the Old Testament? Not really much being done with the Old Testament that we have in existence. And then we talked last time about the Masoretic text, the Masoretic copies made by the Masoretic scribes around AD 900, 1,000 years AD. And of course, these become the manuscripts that are the basis of our modern Bibles. Even today, significantly, our modern day Old Testament are based on the Masoretic text. And we talked about how, critics of the Bible said that's not good manuscript evidence. That the manuscripts that we have our Old Testament based on, that come from, are over 1,000 years older than even the synagogue scrolls. And those themselves are copies. Over 1,000 years of the original. And that's a good point. That was a problem for us. That doesn't mean we couldn't trust it, but that was a really good point that was being made in a weakness of the Old Testament. And of course, all of that was, I wouldn't say it went away, but it pretty much was demolished by the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how significant that is, because now we have manuscript copies of the Old Testament 1,000 years earlier than the Masoretic copy. And so closer to the Old Testament, closer to the original text. And so a comparison needed to be made between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this lesson. But if you look on a map, here's the Dead Sea, and you can see at the top of this is where Qumran is located, not too far from Jerusalem. And this is a place where a group of Jews that were it appears that they were kind of fed up with the leadership in Jerusalem and its corruption, went off into this deserted area in Qumran and established their own Jewish community to live out the Jewish life as they saw it should be lived out, and to interpret the Old Testament scriptures as they believed it should be interpreted. And one of the great things is that they had scribes that made copies of the Old Testament. And then apparently at some point, they kept those copies copies, stored them in clay jars in these caves. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how these were found, their discovery, and why they're significant. But this gives you kind of a neat idea of the topography there. You've got up here a hill, some might call it kind of a mountain. Then it comes down to this flat area. And then you have kind of this eroded area, which forms another kind of hill, mountain, and that's where these caves are found. And you just, unless you're a rock climber or a rappeller, you can't really get into these caves. Very, very difficult. But this is where these scrolls were found. You can actually visit Qumran. There's a little visitor center, as you see there, and there's hiking trails. You can't actually go into the caves, but you can hike right by them, take a very close look at them. You can see how they're numbered. For example, 1 through 3 are up here, 4 and 5 down here, number 6 by itself, 7 and 10, and so forth. And so that gives you kind of the idea of that area. Wanted to show you some visuals of these caves and how they're numbered. And we're going to do that with this visual. Kind of a grainy picture, but you get the idea. Again, caves 1 and 2. This is where the initial discovery was found. So, of course, this is called cave number 1. Right next to it, cave number 2. You have 4 and 5 down here, and this is the picture we were looking at 2 slides earlier, and the next slide we're going to look at that as well. And then you can see the ruins of the Essene people in Qumran, what's called Qumran, and of course the Dead Sea would be behind this hill here, where it's located. Here's another photograph. And again, this is what we saw earlier, cave 4, 6, 10, cave 5. You can't see these other caves, but several caves and where these Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So now you have kind of the idea of where they were located. Let's talk a little bit about these Dead Sea Scrolls. When you start to study this, what you find is that they are identified with certain very interesting symbols. It looks something like this. And you might be like, well, what do these letters and numbers mean? Well, this is the way that they came to identify these scrolls. And so I want to just kind of quickly show you the first number and the first letter is the number of the cave where the scroll was found. So in other words, this would be a scroll found in the Qumran cave number 4. The QOH is a abbreviated name in Hebrew for what book or what kind of writing content it was. In this case, it is a copy of the book of Ecclesiastes. And so it is designated by the QOH. And then the little subscript there, A, is the first copy of the work. So if it has an A, it's the first copy of Ecclesiastes. B would be the second, C the third, and so forth. So there are some of these that have multiple manuscript copies. And so when you see the A there, you're looking at the very first one. B would be the second one, and so forth. And so if you wanted to spend some time, you could kind of get to know these, and you could look at them, and then you would know, okay, I can figure this out. This is found in cave 4. It is of whatever the book is. It's the first copy. This is a chart we're not going to spend a lot of time on. If you want to look at it a little bit more in depth, you can pause it here and take a look at it. But you'll notice these designations we were talked about right here in this column, the cave, the type of book, maybe it has a subscript. And you'll notice as well that some of what was found in these scrolls were actually not just copies, but they were commentaries. of these biblical books. And so you have a commentary on Habakkuk, one of Zephaniah, Isaiah, Nahum, and so forth. Then some of these scrolls are not biblical, but they're actually sectarian. And so you have a scroll known as the Manual of Discipline. You have a scroll known as the War Scroll, which identifies kind of their theology of how they looked at the world and the world in this spiritual battle. You have a scroll with thanksgiving hymns and so forth. You have a collection of different things. For example, this scroll has patriarchal blessings, a scroll full of multiple blessings. And then you have what's called biblical supplements, what's known as the Genesis Apocryphon, or the Sayings of Moses, or the Testament of Levi. And so those are all divided up into the different types or genre of scrolls. But I want you to notice this box up here. Fragments are found from every book of the Old Testament except for Esther. Now that's kind of interesting because Esther is one of those books that we know was questioned by some as to whether it should be part of the Old Testament canon. There were questions about the book of Esther because of its content, the way it goes about, the fact that God's name is never recorded in there. And so the fact that among the Essenes, the book of Esther is missing, where we have a copy of every other Old Testament book, at least one, could tell us that maybe the Essene people looked at the book of Esther as not being canonical and they left it out. It could be simply that Esther didn't survive, but it's kind of interesting that all the others did and it didn't. So I wanted to point that out to you. But the fact that we have found every book, a manuscript copy except for Esther, very significant. Major manuscripts, Isaiah, Psalms, we're going to talk about that in just a second. So how were these found? Well, in 1947, you probably heard the story that there was shepherds tending their sheep in the area. And one particular shepherd, I don't know how he got into this cave, he went into cave number 1, and he found these clay jars. And not sure what he found, but he took them. And what we found is basically come to be known as the first scroll, and eventually came to be discovered. This is actually a manuscript copy of the book of Isaiah. 54 columns written on 24 feet long scroll. The second scroll is called the Manual of Discipline. We talked about that as being the sectarian genre of these. And this was basically a rule book for those Jews living in the Essene community, the do's and the don'ts of being an Essene. Scroll number 3 was a commentary book of, and my little things blocking that, so I don't know I can't remember which book that was, but this was a commentary that might have been on the book of Habakkuk. And then also scroll number 4. Now, scroll number 4 is a work of unknown contents. This later came to be recognized, and we saw this on the chart, as the Genesis Apocryphon. And so he found these 4 scrolls, and these 4 scrolls were originally purchased by a man named Mar Athanasius. I pronounced that as best I could. And so he took these 4 scrolls, and they were in his possession. Well, then also found in that first cave was scroll number 5, a partial copy of Isaiah. Scroll number 6, a work entitled The War of the Sons of Light with the Sons of Darkness. Again, not a biblical book, but a book that reflected their theological view of the world and this spiritual battle they were involved in. Scroll number 7, a collection of Thanksgiving hymns. And so these were purchased by another man, E.L., let's see if I can pronounce this, Sukenik, who was actually of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And so the original discovery, it contained 7 scrolls, and they were bought by 2 different individuals and kept in their possession for a while. But eventually, what happened was that they decided, well, we've got to go check these other caves. And so they started checking these other caves in a very systematic, a very controlled way. And they found many, many more scrolls. We'll talk about that in a second. And eventually, these all came to be part of what's called the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. And what you're seeing here is an actual building as part of that museum. I've not visited this building, but if I'm ever in Jerusalem, I'm definitely going to make a trip here. This is what is called the Shrine of the Book, I believe it's called, the Shrine of the Book. And this is a building that is to resemble the top of a clay jar, reminiscent of the clay jars that these scrolls were found in. And if you were to go inside this building, this is where, in a very controlled environment, these Dead Sea Scrolls are on display. These Dead Sea Scrolls are on display, and you can go and take a look at them. So what we're looking at here is inside, underneath what we were just talking about, that clay jar outside that goes up. This is underneath it. And of course, this is kind of the end of a scroll. And at the end of that scroll, you have encircled there and displayed in protective glass some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then there are also others that are displayed around it, and we'll take a look at that. So if you were to walk up to this scroll, this is what you would find. You could look at these, and if you could read Hebrew, you could actually read this and know what you're looking at. But you can see how well preserved they are, and on display now. And from what I understand, that these are displayed for a little while, then they're taken and they're put in storage, protected, and others are then put out here. They're kind of rotated. And then along the sides of that, you have other Dead Sea Scrolls and information, and you just walk through here, and you can learn a lot more than what we're talking about here. So with the finding of these initial scrolls and their identification, some of them being manuscripts of the Old Testament, as I talked about before, efforts to search out these other caves were made. This cave search paid off. Scrolls were found in 10 to 12 other caves, and in all they found 800 scrolls and many partial fragments. And so think about that, how significant that is. So the biggest number of manuscripts among the scrolls are of the book of Psalms. There are 36 total manuscripts. Deuteronomy is in second with 29. Then Isaiah with 21 manuscripts, Exodus 17, and Genesis 15. Now this could simply be those that survived, but the sheer number of them seems to indicate, gives you a view of the books they consider to be most important to their theology. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are believed to date from around 100 BC to 100 AD, or AD 100. Some will put them as early as 300 BC. But you'll notice that AD 100. So the Essenes were living and copying the Old Testament even the time of Jesus. Throughout the time of the apostles, that whole New Testament period. And that has led many to question a series of questions. Number one, was Jesus an Essene? Did Jesus ever visit the Qumran community? And did Jesus know about the Essenes? Well, I think the answer to the last one is yes. I would imagine Jesus probably did know about them. But there's no evidence that Jesus ever was part of the Qumran community or ever visited there. There's no specific evidence that Jesus ever went and visited with those people. And so is it possible? It's possible. But I don't think there's any evidence that he was actually part of that community or part of the Essenes. So we talk about some of the most significant things about these, some significant, what we're going to call finds. Well, number one, from the initial scrolls, right, the initial finding, a complete copy of Isaiah was found, designated in the first cave, a copy of Isaiah. This has been called simply the Isaiah scroll. This scroll is believed to date around 100 BC, or maybe even earlier. And what is interesting, again, we talked about there's this comparison being made now that we have the Dead Sea manuscripts, to compare them to the 1,000-year older Masoretic text. And when you compare this scroll, you find it reads the same as the Masoretic text. That's really significant, isn't it? Now, is that true of every single scroll? Not actually. For example, the Exodus scroll, which was found in Cave 4, designated, as you can see there, dates back to the early part of the 2nd century BC. It contains some 40 columns from an original 57, so part of this is missing. At places, this manuscript agrees with the Samaritan Pentateuch, we talked about that in an earlier lesson, and the Septuagint, but differs from the Masoretic text. And so that is interesting, that it lines up with these other copies, but not with the Masoretic text. And so just bringing forth the truth in all honesty. But again, that's why these are so significant, because they really do give us another great source that we can use today and to make sure, okay, what is the best translation of the Old Testament? What's the best translation of this verse or that verse? And is it the Masoretic text that's best? Or maybe in this case, the Septuagint sheds more and better evidence to the translation of that text. Then another significant find is this, that 2 copies of the book of Samuel were found. The first one, designated with the subscript A there, found in Cave 4. It believed to be dating from around the 1st century BC and has about 10% of 1st and 2nd Samuel. You have a second scroll, again, found in the same cave, letter B, second scroll, has parts of several chapters of 1 Samuel and dates perhaps as early as the 3rd century BC. They are in agreement with the Septuagint, and not only that, but experts consider them to be better renderings of those verses than the Masoretic text. Again, does that mean the Masoretic text is untrustworthy? No. But now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, it gives us a much better manuscript evidence that we can use today, that experts use today, in making a very trustworthy copy of the Old Testament, a translation for us today. So, what's the big thing? Well, we say it again as we bring this lesson to a close. The Dead Sea Scrolls help bridge the large gap between the Hebrew Bible and the much later Hebrew text. A comparison between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic manuscripts show no significant variations. Even in what we just talked about, that does not mean the Masoretic text is just untrustworthy. But experts find that there are better translations at parts when it comes to the Septuagint, or even maybe sometimes the Samaritan Pentateuch. But no significant variations, even though we have a span of 1,000 years between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. So thus, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls were 1,000 years apart, this comparison showed the quality transmission remained and continues to remain trustworthy today. And that is so significant because we have so many people telling, being critical of the Bible, telling people you can't trust the copies. You can't trust the Old Testament because they're made from copies of copies of copies, and these are made 1,000 years later. Well, when you really study it, we find that there's a little bit of truth to that. But the truth that you can't trust the Old Testament copies, and therefore you can't trust our modern day that's just not true. The evidence clearly shows you can. Even before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we could, but now we know what a significant find they were. And so what I want you to take from this is that you can trust the Bible. The evidence is there that what we have here is not some loosey-goosey translation, but a very, very solid. You can put your confidence in it as you read the Old Testament that you're getting the best translation showing the original message that came from God. I'm so glad you joined us for this series of lessons. Again, you could go even deeper than what we did here, but I hope that this helps you maybe fill in some questions you had, some gaps, maybe as to the Old Testament, some of the things that you might have heard of the Old Testament. Again, this is a work of the Edgewood Church of Christ here in Lakeland, Florida. If you're ever in Polk County, please come and join us for worship. You can go to our website, which is edgewoodcofc.com, and you can see our worship times, Bible studies. There are other videos available on our website that you can learn from, or on our YouTube page as well. We also have a Facebook page that you can simply Google Edgewood Church of Christ, Lakeland, Florida, and you can see our lessons up there as well. Again, thank you for joining us in the study. Hope you will look at some of our other videos and visit with us when you can.